All right, all you shy people who haven't eaten yet, you better get up there. You boys right there, I know you're shy. Just jump in there. Just a reminder again, if anybody has a car parked in the front of the hotel next door here, you may be getting hauled away or ticketed right now, so I wouldn't park there. I would go find a different parking spot. FYI. All right, we're going to be starting in a couple of minutes, so I'm going to ask everybody come back to your seats, grab your soup, your Bannock if you're just finishing up. Calling on our next speakers in a couple of minutes. I'm just full of that soup. Who else enjoyed the soup? Let's give him a big hand. Soup and Bannock, tea. That was made by Cookham Daisies. Cookham Daisies, Daisy Henderson. That's who they named it after in honor of their grandmother. Their location is 287 Gary Street in the Garrick Hotel downtown. I've eaten there before and it's wonderful food. Home cooked meals, delicious as always. So we're going to move on. If everybody can settle in and I think everybody's full now from all that soup. Oh my God, I can't get enough of that. Anyways, I'm going to be calling on Craig Blacksmith and Albert Taylor. If you guys want to make your way up here. They're going to be discussing implications of the Indian Act. So I'm calling upon Craig Blacksmith and Albert Taylor to make your way down here.
Homitakiupi. Friends and relatives, I want to introduce, uh, he's an Unka in our language. We don't like using the word elder because elder has a negative connotation to it in that an elder opens and closes meetings with prayers and sits quiet all day, and then at the end of the day they ask him, do you agree with this? And the elder says, yeah, gets his money and he's out the door. So he'd prefer to be called an Unka, even though elder is the common word. Um, Uncle is not fluent in the English language. So he's going to speak Dakota, and then he's gonna try and translate, and then I'll come on and do the translation later.
Amitakos. Damakotaga la kormi chasiki ampo hakana temakip. We charged to kitchens at 1914, 18. We charged him a co. Mind in my foreign name is Albert Taylor Sr. And my Dakota name, like I'm going to translate that, it means the last attack before dawn. That was given to me by a veteran from the First World War in 1928. Well, incidentally, I'm going to be 89 years old this year. And all the people in attendance remember that because you all each owe me $89, November the 5th. You know, I like joking, yeah? But one of the things I'm going to get right to the point because, you know, we don't have too much time. I want to talk about this Indian act. Artero, I could have checked you up here. Could have shit you a hick, a hehuniga, a head hell could have open hitch here. Onka. Tako ko opi kako ba tukto nani hinap te nani chop che han wa shichuk de nakola ishtago kapidoye. And my stepfather Gilbert Chakey up here, he told me in 1492 when that clown by the name of Christopher Columbus came to our country, he said, watch out for this clown, he said, because he's a trickster, he said. And you know, all the white men that came down here, they're all blind, he said. Everywhere they look, all they see is dollar signs. And when they seen all the wealth and everything, they started to write down things, how they're going to take that land away from us. O komitaku pihena artero I kana wohda kahena de makasi tomnia oyagu yakum pituskawa gdekchi. What my stepfather said, me and my nephew, Craig Taylor, Craig Blacksmith, we're trying to reach all over the world about this trickster and what he said. And one of the things I'm going to get right down to it is, you know, when that clown came to our country, we were already self-government. We knew how to take care of ourselves. We didn't have no child and family services. And this was created by that white clown by the name of Christopher Columbus and his descendants, the white people. And by God, you know, they sure hell of a good job on it with this Indian Act. You know, we have to get rid of this Indian Act. You know, I have my nephew as my interpreter, and you know, like we go all over, and I wanted to share a story, a little story that just happened in 2012. We were on our way to to the Big Apple, New York City, on horseback with the Unity Riders. But you know, like it was going to take a long, so we left about. They were going to be there in about a couple of days' time, and then we left. And then on our way to New York, like we were traveling down on the south side of the Great Lakes, and from Buffalo, we got onto the freeway, and then we were going down towards New York, and then my nephew said, "You know, Uncle, there's a little reserve here. We should go and visit." He said. So it was in the Ohio Valley. I forget the name. I think Oyahannanesh or something like that. And the head man was Jake Edwards. We got there in the evening, and you know, they were all ready for us. Anyway, like we talked, and you know, we exchanged gifts, and you know, Jake Edwards told us, you know, like you have a long way to go. So we're going to try and get halfway to New York, to that place where the hippies had their, Woodstock, New York. We're going to try and get there, and Jake Edwards said, you know, before you leave, we're going to feed you, and then we're going to have a little prayer too. And they have these long houses down there. I guess they have them in Canada too, down east. They had a long house there facing east and west. And then on the north side, there was a door there, a beautiful door. Then that long house was made out of big logs, split in half. And it is beautiful. So Jake Edwards said, like, we have to go inside there to pray and to eat. You know, I seen this door here, and I don't know where everybody went, but I seen that door there, so I opened the door, and then I walked in there. After I got in there, you know, everybody was coming in through a door on the west side. And you know, all of a sudden, everything changed. Nobody talked. And you know, we had a prayer, and then we had supper, and then we left. As soon as we left, my nephew said, you know, Uncle, what did we do wrong? Everybody kept quiet, nobody talked. And you know, I tried to remember what I said. I hope I didn't say anything to offend him. Huh? But anyway, we talked about it, and then we were trying to get to Woodstock before too long. Huh? Anyway, like, it was forgotten. And that next year, 2013, they had a Sundance up in Fort Capel, Saskatchewan. And I went down there, and then there's some Mohawks that came down from New York. You know, I was given a chance to speak, and everybody was given a chance to speak. And the Sundance is going to start on a Thursday, the 13th. And this Mohawk was given a chance to speak, and then he said, you know, I have some very important news, he said. You know, like, he was kind of loud, just like me, he like talking. Yeah. And then he said, before I speak, he said, I want to share a big news with the Dakota people, he said. They spoke at the United Nations, and then they told the audience from all over the world that there was only one nation in the United States, North America also. There was only one nation, and it was the Dakota Nation. Everybody shouted, and they were hugging each other, and people were crying. And then I got a phone call there, and from down home, down from Sioux Valley, and there was a tornado went through there, and it took the roof off my house. Like I heard home, but before that guy spoke, he said we had to decide. There was a day coming 200 years ago that a Dakota was going to walk through that door, and like they couldn't decide right from Canada down to New York City and past that. My God, it couldn't be that guy there, like mentioning me. Couldn't be that guy. That guy's crazy, huh? And they finally decided, and when a Dakota walked through that door, the natives all over the world are going to rise, huh? So that was in 2012. And I'm doing some things because my mom was a medicine woman. Then my stepfather, he was a real a traditionalist. Everything is falling into place. I just want to share this with you, but before, my main thing is we got to get rid of this act, this Indian Act. Canada belongs to us. Canada, North America, we own that. My friends, I'm glad to be here. I'm looking forward to be here. And I see a lot of little kids, a lot of our future leaders sitting here. But I see a problem with them too, because it's like that at home too in Sioux Valley. We had about over 100 suicides and adults too. But for our young ones to be leaders, I don't want no potheads for leaders. You got to smarten up and, get back to, we were self-governed before the arrival of that clown by the name of Christopher Columbus. We got to get that back. We were a praying people. And me speaking like this, I'm not scared of nothing, huh? I was the only one in Canada, and then another couple from down from Edmonton. In 1968, I joined the American Indian Movement. When it started, I was searching, because I was in a residential school for 10 years, and then my brother was injured in school, and as a result, he died from it. I was mad, huh? But that wasn't the right way to do it. I found that out after I was wild for about 40 years. I never touched my mom because the priests and nuns, all the Catholics, they told everybody that my mom was the devil, that my stepfather was the devil. I was young and by God, I was pretty wild, but there was a group of people called law people, RCMP. at that time then, when the law picked you up without any charges or anything like that, you know, you go to court and next day like you're sentenced. And one of my partners there that I was wild with, he got 5 years. So I was next on the chopping block. So I made a run for it. I packed a few clothes and I got on the freight. I went to Lake Heads and I went right across from there to Wisconsin and ended up in Louisiana. But you know, the Ku Klux Klan was in high gear at that time in the 1940s. They were killing the black people by the hundreds every day. And you know, I thought to myself, what the hell is wrong with these people, huh? I thought this only happened up in Alberta, Saskatchewan. By God, it's happening, and it's even worse down here, huh? And you know, I talked to people from all over the world, to Russia, China, Africa, Nelson Mandela, the late Nelson Mandela camp. I wanted to share something with you before I close off. From Africa, one of the lieutenants from the late Nelson Mandela. Do you know what a reserve is? Oh yes, we do, because you know we do research work on it. A reserve is a parcel of land set aside for all fenced in for animals, he said. There's only 2 continents in this world, Africa and North America, that have reserves, he said. As long as you people accept that Indian Act and also the leaders that clown made, called Chief and Council, he said, you know, nothing is going to happen, he said. So with that, you know, we got to get rid of that Indian Act, and all the resources that we have in Canada belongs to us. We have to sit at the negotiating table when they're selling our oil with our resources. This is what's Canada. This is what's keeping it going. With that, Pidama, Pido, you gave me your time to talk, and this is my message. This is why I came down to Winnipeg. With that, thank you very much.
Well, we've got 20 minutes, and I think I got 2 minutes left. My uncle, when he was 6 years old, if there's any young guys here, when he was 6 years old, he was taken in front of the whole residential school in La Brette, and they told the audience that his parents were, that he was the son of the devil. And later on that week, Uncle's got scars on his arms. He covered them up with tattoos, jail tattoos. 6-year-old boy, they hung him up by his arms, pressed his arms against the steam register. And they scalded the skin off his arms. And I never knew that. I never knew that till 2 years ago. This man here will give you the shirt off his back. He'll give you his last dollar. And what the government did to him, they wanted him to be angry. So he joined AIM, but he knew that that wasn't the right way, so he came back to who he was, which is a human being. In our language, there's a word called wakishaka. Washaka means to be strong, physically strong. Ki is your inner strength, your spirit, your soul. You combine those 2 words together, wakishaka, that's your inner strength, your resilience. So the government, he was talking about potheads too. There's all kinds of things that the government does to us. Prescription drugs are the worst right now. We have to leave these things alone. In our culture, the stories that are passed on, up until 8 years ago, I was just a run-of-the-mill Indian. I, I have 3 daughters. I have 6 grandchildren. I chased the dollar just like anybody else. I made sure my family was taken care of. Wayne and I have a little bit of history together back in the day, university days, that kind of stuff. But me too, I came back to who I was because I listened. I listened to him. We have a Dakota leader named Orville Smoke from Dakota Plains. It's the tiniest community, way under the radar. Never hear of them. That's who I started working for 8 years ago. And you know this man, he's a chief, Indian Affairs. We went to the Indian Affairs office, and they wanted him to conform to this Indian Act. He had revenue that was generated from VLTs, and they wanted him to record this revenue inside that audit, the band audit. Every reserve in Manitoba does this. They record their revenue inside that audit so that the government can see what you're making. And what this chief said, he told him, he says, or they threatened him, you record your income or we're going to cut your funding. And I heard this man say, go ahead, cut the funding, he said. And you know what? They never did. You know, when Oka was in full blast, 1992, the government still funded those reserves, the Mohawk communities. It doesn't matter what we do, they're going to fund it, they're going to send that money to the reserves. What they do is they withhold it for a certain length of time so that our elected leaders can't conduct business in a normal fashion. Payroll is late, checks bounce, all this kind of stuff. And the reason why the government does that is to make us look bad. So I heard somebody talking about the divisions. We're not separate people. We're one people. When the Europeans came here, they described this place as paradise. I was watching hockey the other night, and they had one of those big nets on, and that John Cabot or Cabot, I don't know if some of you have seen that commercial. They're telling him, come, Captain, come. And they look over the side of that ship, and the waters are so full of cod that ship can't go. So they tell him to dump over a bucket. They lift up that bucket, it's full of cod. And then they show these people back in France or Spain, wherever it is they came from, and they're telling them that there's enough fish there to feed your empire for the rest of time. That's the way our land was when these people came here. We had respect for each other. That story that my uncle told when we went to the Mohawk communities, we still have that respect with each other. They have their protocol there, so we had to go to the Onondaga Reserve. That's where that Chief Jake Edwards is from. And Uncle didn't know that he wasn't supposed to go through that door. They don't use that door. He walked through it, and that's why everybody was quiet. A year later, they phoned him and told him that what their prophecy was, that when a Dakota walks through that door, that's when the Native people are going to stand up again. And all the nations here, there's Dene, there's Cree, there's Ojibways, that what the government calls you. Anishinaabe, Nahio. Those are the names that you have. And that's what the government is doing to us. They're just dividing us. Well, you have this treaty here. And I don't know if Grand Chief has already spoken about that, about this Indian being legal fiction. But that's what the government does to us. So this Indian Act, just listen to those 2 words, Indian Act. Has nothing to do with treaties. It has nothing to do with anything. It's the British government that passed that law. Why did they pass that law? Because it's the land. It's not about us. If it was about us, we would be taken care of. We'd be living good. All they're interested in is the land. And that's what that Indian Act does. It's a trust. Land's held in trust. And people think it's just the reserves. It isn't. It's the whole land. And the reason why we know that is because we got into a court case with the government. And they said because of the Royal Proclamation, 1763, King George III, a man with a crown on his head sitting in England, wrote a letter, puts words on paper, and he hands it over to his people over here. Nobody can buy land in North America except me. And I'm going to do it, and I'm going to protect the Indians. Why do we have so much respect and honor and for the government? The government is killing us, and they're using this Indian Act to do that. If you go online, everybody has cell phones, they have access to the internet. Read the Indian Act for yourself. It tells you right in there that it's a trust. And they're lying to the taxpayers, and they're telling the taxpayers that they're paying for us. That's where this racism comes from, this segregation. South Africa has apartheid. And the reason why apartheid was so big in South Africa was the blacks outnumbered the white people there 4-1. If they allowed them to vote, if they allowed them to have driver's license, if they allowed them to have anything, the black would have took over that country. But they racially segregated them, the black people, because the black people outnumbered the whites. So it wasn't until the world jumped on board that apartheid got wiped out. But what happened in South Africa was they made an agreement. And so the colonists are still in control over there. That's the danger with this talking, when we talk about getting rid of the Indian Act, they're talking about replacing it with something. How many of you have heard of that 1869 white paper? What were they going to do with that 1869 white paper? That's what they told us. If you read that paper for yourself, read that document for yourself. They were going to take that Indian Act and abolish that and replace it with the Indian Lands Act. So the government was still going to be in control of the land and the revenues. And they were going to give us a little more responsibility to make laws on the reserve, things like that. The community that I grew up in is the Sioux Valley. We have a self-government agreement. West Bank, Seashelt, Nisga's, they all have their own agreements. But if you read those agreements for yourselves, James Bay Agreement in Quebec, these are not self-government agreements. All they are is a little bit of responsibility confined to a certain area. That's not sovereignty. If we're sovereign right across this continent. And that's what we have to start teaching our young people. Because I'm gonna say something that's gonna offend the older generation. The older generation has so much respect for the government and the Queen and these agreements and these pieces of paper. That stuff is garbage. It does not belong to us. We didn't write it. We never agreed to the British North America Act in 1867. The Queen did that. They said, here, John A. Macdonald, Etienne Cartier, the fathers of Confederation. You're going to start hearing this because next year is the 150th anniversary. They gave them a piece of paper that said, here, you govern. And in that document, section 91 of that is the federal authorities. You look up number 24 on that list. It says Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. That's how they have jurisdiction over us, because we believe in this Indian Act and we think this Indian Act gives us rights. The reason why we're not taxable is because we didn't agree to any of those things. They restricted it to the reserve. Grand Chief, can I pick on you a little bit here? AMC, Assembly of Manitoba Chief's office is downtown Winnipeg. It used to be the old Indian Affairs office. Is that building, Grand Chief, is it reserve land? Has it been converted to reserve land? Are your staff still tax exempt? You know why they're tax exempt? Because the government allowed a loophole. They said as long as the home office is located on a reserve, that the people living or working in the city, they're tax exempt. The government receives its salaries. They give themselves the power. The Queen gave themselves their own power to set their salaries. So a minister of parliament all they have to do is be in office for a few years and they get a retirement pension for life. Same with all the INAC employees. So who's going to upset that apple cart when we say we're going to get rid of this Indian Act? The government's not going to go for it. They're going to apologize left and right. They did that yesterday. Ontario did it next. Oh, we're sorry, Indians. Here's some money. But as long as that Indian Act is still there, there's never going to be any reconciliation. I hope that nobody has ever been in an abusive relationship or anybody has ever gone to treatment. You can apologize all day, but if you do it again, you abuse again or you hurt somebody again, what does that apology mean? It doesn't mean anything. And that's what an abusive relationship is, and this is the way the government treats us. Oh, we're sorry, Indians, and it's a big love fest right now with the Liberals. They're handing out money like candies. That's not their money, that's ours. And that's what Orunga is telling us. In the Indian Act, look on page 40 of the Indian Act. It says management of Indian monies. They're supposed to use the revenue from the land for us, for the native people. And then there's an interest calculation in there. And we're trying to find that item, that line item in there. That's why in that, I don't know if you know, but the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs passed a resolution this past spring to abolish that Indian Act and to get a report on the revenue system that the government is using. Because they're lying to the taxpayers, telling them that they're paying for us. And that's where all this racism comes from. So I'm gonna close off with a couple things. At the back there, there's a painting that was done by an artist. And as part of this road to Niagara, we're gonna try and sell T-shirts for fundraiser. So if we sell those T-shirts with that on it, and then on the back we wanna put a slogan there. Every native language in Canada, we want a slogan that says, "It's time to come home now." Because it's time for us to come home now, not physically, but mentally up here. And that's what we want to do, but of course we don't have any money, right? So we have to do this as a fundraiser. So if we sell those for $20, we're kind of canvas people, $20 is a good deal for a T-shirt. We'll have that on the front, and then on the back we'll have every language in Canada that says it's time to come home now. And we'll take that with us. The second thing I wanted to tell you was I have 2 daughters. 2 years ago, my daughters both gave birth to daughters. I got 2 granddaughters. And they were born 11 days apart. You know, something happened to me that when they were born. I have a lot of friends, like female friends, and they tell me stories that they go through, even just walking down the street. My auntie is in her 60s, late 60s. She dresses the way traditional, you know, the dress and the long skirt, that kind of thing. And a man in Walmart, started speaking to her in using sexual terms. And I have friends on Facebook, and they talk about things that happened to them, these women. There was one recently again, this lady who came up behind her and started calling her an effing Indian, and you're wasting our taxpayer money, like right on the street. And how many of our women here, just show of hands, how many women have here experienced racism in the past year? Is there any woman here that has not experienced racism? That's what I mean. We're supposed to be here. My uncle here expects me to protect women and children. How do we do that when we allow the government to neuter us as men? We have to get rid of this Indian Act. My name is Craig Blacksmith. I'm on Facebook. There's all kinds of documentation that I can show you what it is that I'm telling you. So if you want to know any more information, just get a hold of me and I'll give it to you. This is factual stuff. It's not conspiracy theories. It's not innuendo. It's not government rhetoric. This is the actual facts. The government is using that Indian Act to keep the land away from us. And as long as we acknowledge that piece of paper, we're never going to get out of this. And I fear for our women, because this is a sick country. This is a sick country. There's no way to get around that. 110,000 of our kids are in childcare right now without their parents. Think the residential schools are over? They're not. Half of the population in jails and prisons are made up of our people. Where do you think that money comes from to keep them in there? That comes from us. You must have heard of Cindy Blackstock in her case. $7.4 billion is spent on childcare. That's our money. Anybody on social assistance here, how much do you get for a child? 150 bucks? You know what happens to your child when it gets apprehended? That foster parent gets $900 minimum. If they label your child as having any kind of disability, that goes right up to $5,000. Our inmates are worth $122,000 apiece every year. Why don't they spend that money on us before they get into trouble? This is the kind of stuff that the government is hiding from not only us, but from the Canadian people. You talk to anybody. I've done it. I've gone to Tim Hortons coffee shops, sat down with people, and I asked them, do you think your taxpayer dollars are paying for us? And that's what they're being told. That's racial segregation. My sister donated a kidney a couple of months ago. We went to the Health Sciences Center. It says right on there, Aboriginal health, it says. That's racial segregation. And that all comes from this Indian Act. So, thank you for your time. We were supposed to be here till 20 after 1, but I think we went over a little bit. So, thank you on behalf of my own camp.
I want to tell you a very important thing. I have no allegiance to anybody, any country. The only one I have allegiance to is Wakantaka, God, and to this beautiful, once the beautiful country. Those are the only two allegiances that I have as a Dakota.
Thank you. There was supposed to be a brief time for questions. Does anybody have any questions? Quick. Go ahead, sir. $1876. I'll have to check that out. The Liberals.
Under the Trudeau government.
Liberals.
Another liberal government.
Yeah.
So if we're going to sit down with the liberals, again, we better be very careful.
Yeah.
And I think that you Anishinaabe people need to stop sitting with the enemy and pretending to be friends.
Yeah.
This is
That's where
something really wrong going on here.
That's where
And
the
it's been going on
grassroots comes
for
in.
140 years. The Liberal Party has permitted this apartheid system in this country for 140 years while they shake hands with our leaders and they rape our people. We need to wake up. This ain't our friends. This ain't our friends. These are our enemies. Anybody that is trying to destroy us as a people is our enemy. We cannot look at them as friends. just because you're getting a few dollars to put in your pocket. That is wrong, people. I am South American. You want to talk suffering? My mom was tortured. My dad was tortured, and I had to get kicked out of my country to come here. I've been here 35 years watching you guys divide yourselves for a few dollars. I bitch at almost every chief in this room. I think you all know that, and I've never changed my tune. I will never surrender. And I think that you all have, because you wanted to look good with some parties, because you wanted to take some pictures with some dignitaries. Screw Justin Trudeau. His dad was the one that wanted to eliminate us as a people. Let's not forget who we are, people.
Something that I wanted to let the young people know too. Like I said, 8 years ago I woke up. But you know what? I was born into this system. I went to school in Crocus Plains and Brandon, 1,200 students, and I still have a lot of friends from there. I'll just call them white friends. And we sit and they talk and they say, you know, Craig, we didn't do this. This happened 100 years ago. I said, I tell them, but you know what? This Indian Act is still here. I said, you and I, both of us, were born into this system. But being born into a system doesn't give consent. So this road to Niagara, I commend the Grand Chief for taking this, for standing up as a leader at the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. It takes a lot of courage to do those kinds of things. So, any other questions? Questions? I don't. Please, no statements. Thank you very much.
Jimmy Gwitch, Craig Blacksmith, and Albert Teller. Jimmy Gwitch. There's what is this? A Dodge Journey, a red one. License plate HKT 959. You're going to get hauled away pretty soon. The owner's in the building. License plate HKT 9S9 or 959. Parked in a no parking stall in front of building. So, FYI. We're going to move it along to our next speaker, who is Mr. Paul Chartrand. He's going to be discussing Indian Act timeline and various amendments. Paul Chartrand.
Hello, is this working? No, that doesn't work. Okay, I'll try again. Is this working? Oh, okay. It's like those rock and roll singers. They have to practically swallow the darn thing so it works. Okay. All right, I'm going to try that. Well, I need bonjour. Tansi. Kia ora. Good afternoon. My name is Paul Chartrand, and I'm from St. Laurent in Manitoba, and we're a pretty large family. We have relatives all over the place, mainly from where I am to across the lake, up north, down Treaty 4, various areas. Pretty big family. I want to thank those who have organized this event. I want to thank the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs for organizing these initiatives. Oh, is that better now? Yeah. Just have to get used to this. I'm not used to chewing on a microphone. Grand Chief Neepanak and the team at the AMC. It's been a pleasure to have a bit of an involvement working with the folks there on this team for the Road to Niagara, as it is called. Meeting with the elders, quite a number of them. Harry Bone, who was here this morning, and others. Also, the young people. Been interesting to meet young Jeremy McKay, who is here. And it's good to see some old friends in the audience as well. I see, I don't want to forget people that I know, but I noticed Danny Highway back there, and I saw Dave Rundle and other people floating around. So nice to see everybody. Good to be here. And I've been told that I have 20 minutes, so I better get cracking on what I'm going to talk about, which is the Indian Act. And what I've been asked to do is to describe the Act through its various amendments through the lens of the Federal Royal Commission that was established in the 1990s to advise the federal government on policy. It was called the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and I was one of the commissioners appointed by the Prime Minister to that particular commission. And if you look at the final reports of that federal commission, you will see how did they get turned into legal relations of control by the Indian Act? The simple answer is they did it because they could. You must recognize that things are done, and sometimes you look for reasons for doing it after you've decided that it's your interest to do it. But there's the point, that the Indian Act was for the purposes of Canada, not for the purpose of the Indigenous people. As a result of what I've tried to suggest, the Indian Act has put a very damper on state Indigenous relations in this country. There is a suffocating, overwhelming sense of injustice. And I have suggested in one of my writings that a true vision of Canada must be a vision of a North American country. It must be a true vision of Canada, will be a vision of Canada that is built on its Indigenous foundations. And that means not only the inclusion of the populations, it means including the ideas and the visions of the people. And in order to build such a Canada, you have to build institutions, public institutions of the kind that the people can see themselves in it. How do young people today see themselves as belonging to Canada? One of the saddest and most memorable comments in my mind about this important issue is a quotation from Maclean's magazine. I don't know how long. I was born during the Second World War, 1943, so I'm getting a little forgetful. I don't know how long ago I read this in Maclean's magazine. But the magazine people interviewed a man from Northern Ontario. And they had a picture of him with his young son on the doorstep of his home on a reserve in Northern Ontario. And this is what he said, and I remember his words. He said, "How can I teach my son to be proud of himself when Canada is not proud of him?" And that is what the Indian Act did. One of the things that the Indian Act did is it changed the identity of the Indigenous people. It changed the character of those allied nations and made them into individual persons that are imaginary legal witchcraft. An imaginary Indian that is divorced from family, from community, from kinship relations. And that only exists in order to be eliminated. And this is what was done even before the Indian Act itself in 1876. As many of you have heard, it was first done in 1876, but it was based on laws that had already been passed before Canada. In 1857, the legislation was called the Gradual Enfranchisement Act, the Gradual Civilization Act. And that was the end of the nation relation that had been proclaimed in various places, including something called one of the Royal Proclamations, the one of 1763 that some of you might have heard about. So that nation-to-nation relationship of former allies was transformed, where the colonial government and then the Canadian government defined imaginary individuals. It didn't matter who you were, whether you're Cree, Anishinaabe, or whatever. You became a single individual, and you existed for the purpose of having a status that could be eliminated in a process called enfranchisement. And that purpose was effected through the 1869 Statute of Canada, the Gradual Enfranchisement Act. So both the lands and the people, this is one of the fundamental points about Indigenous law in Canada and in the United States and elsewhere. is that both the people and the land, through the device called Indian title, they were recognized for a purpose, and that purpose was to do away with them. In other words, recognize to extinguish. That was done to both the people and the land. Now, listening to the speakers here today, I'm impressed by one of the issues that is found in a study of the Indian Act. It has to do with ceremony. You know, I notice things change, and one of the things I noticed recently is the popularity of a book called Clearing the Plains, written by some author, Dashak, I think it was. As he admits, I didn't read the book, but because there's nothing new in the book. Everything that he writes about is already known and already published. But for some reason, publicity or whatever seemed to have captured the imagination of a lot of news media people and other people. But this clearing the plains happened, you know, in the prairies, but it happened elsewhere as well. And of course, he was referring to the starvation policy of the government, where people were starved into submission. This was a very, very deliberate policy. Slavery and starvation by the invaders. So one of the keys for control then was to starve. As one official put it, remember, we can control men through their stomachs. So you starve with food. You weaken the body. But the other thing that I heard people talk about today here, elders and other people, is another starvation. It's a starvation of the spirit. Because in order to really kill the people, you have to kill their spirit. And it is through the ceremony that you weaken the power of the spirit of the people. And that was one of the designs and objects of the Indian Act. You can't function well without having a lot of focus and a really good feeling about yourself, a lot of self-confidence. I participated in sports when I was a young man. I can tell you that. I've been on national teams and so on. And I can tell you, you cannot perform well if you don't have an extremely high level of self-confidence and a tremendous focus on your job. So we know that starvation of the spirit will destroy that. It affects that. And so the Indian Act, among other things, made illegal ceremonial life of the indigenous people. And it has had a tremendous effect. It was only in 1951 that the Indian Act eliminated the criminal sanctions that were put on ceremonial life of the indigenous people. People could not practice their religion. People could not teach their grandchildren how to pray. It was criminalized. People went to jail for it. Even in the 1900s. One of the well-known stories is about that of an old man, an old Cree man. I think he was Cree, might have been Ojibwe, I'm not sure, because the facts are a little fuzzy in the reports, but he was 90 years old or 90 years old, blind, and he was sentenced to 2 months jail in Regina for practicing his religion. Where was that from? That was from the Indian Act. So that's how the Indian Act treated the starvation of the spirit, by destroying the culture. It destroyed the economy. It destroyed the potlatch, part of the economic system of some indigenous people. These things were outlawed against the law. People were jailed. Chiefs were jailed. The great chief Payapot, I hope they're teaching his story in the schools here. There may be some teachers here, I don't know. But I would hope, particularly in the schools that are run by the First Nations, that the students would all be able to tell you about the stories of the great chiefs, Payapat, Mr. Musqua, and the great military strategist, Fine Day. That's probably the case now. I haven't been to schools for many decades. I really don't know what's happening in the schools. Let me just take the very brief time that I have to make a few very general points about the Act, and then we'll have some time for questions if there are. First of all, my first point is this. So here are some key points to remember about the Indian Act. One is that it destroyed the nation relationship. It destroyed the recognition of nations, which was done by the invaders when they needed the allies. It changed it into an individual called an Indian, which was an imagined person, not defined according to being an Anishinaabe or Cree or family or community or territory or spiritual relationship to the land, to this artificial creature that was to be eliminated. And that elimination actually was a part of a three-pronged process that the federal government, through the Indian Act, which administered this policy, always aimed to do. They try to extinguish indigenous people, do away with, try to save money, and you can see how doing away with people where you have obligations, such as paying treaty monies, then you save money. And the third policy objective was to have the provinces foot the bill for any expenses dealing with Indian administration. The other thing is that the Indian Act imposed a foreign system, the European system of government, upon the people, which is the one we have today in the Indian Act. That is imposed unilaterally. The people fought it. And that is one thing you must remember about the Indian Act. The Indian Act, as I said before, had the purpose of eliminating indigenous people. But the people are still here. Why is that? There's only one reason. And the reason because of the political action of the people in resisting the purposes of Canada of eliminating the people. So it's a political action of people who permitted the people and the land to survive, and people who are trying to show what the Indian Act does and to do away with it, realize those objectives and are trying to change those objectives. Self-government in the Indian Act, I call, involve weaken small powers over local things. I like to refer to it as the weeds and garbage can authority. These were the bylaws that the Indian Act permitted local councils to deal with. And in those days, believe it or not, this will seem strange today, but in the 1800s, the idea that a local community could govern itself was thought to be like a reward. It's supposed to be something, really, really good. So the people were expected to get trained in the ways of the invaders. So here you look after the weeds and the garbage cans. I say that because I have been struck by the similarity between the powers in the Indian Act and the powers that are given to indigenous local community groups where they are recognized by state governments in other places, for example, like the Queensland State Aborigines Protection Act in Australia. Very similar. Weeds and garbage can, that's what you can deal with. So that's the conception of government that was imposed through the Indian Act. I'll mention very briefly the main amendments for those of you who may want to follow up or identify some of these events. And I'll tell you where some of the places where you can find this information. I mentioned before you can find the information in Chapter 10 of the first volume of the Federal Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. You can find it in a INAC publication called The Historical Development of the Indian Act, and you can find it in a range of other articles that have been published in various places if you do a bit of research. The 1857 Act, which was a colonial piece of legislation before Canada, that statute was called the Gradual Civilization Act, and it's the one that spelled the end of the recognition of nations as happened in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So that's the death of the nation-to-nation relationship. 1857 Gradual Civilization Act. 1869 Gradual Enfranchisement Act. This act provided that a definition of Indians, and it gave a narrow definition. For one reason, you eliminate them, you eliminate federal responsibility, and you lower your costs. And so it was a technique to reduce costs and to eliminate the indigenous people. And the way it worked is that if a man was thought to be able to look after himself according to the standards of the invaders, then he was enfranchised. That is, he no longer became an Indian. And this was regarded as a reward. There was a 6-month jail penalty for someone saying that he was enfranchised if in fact he was not. It was regarded as a reward. So you see the psychological assault on the identity of indigenous people? The Act always said it's not good to be an Indian because the Act says you have to be happy that you're no longer an Indian. You see, that was the purpose of the Act. So you see, this psychological assault, that some author called it, has had a tremendous effect on the public perception of indigenous people. And it's a tremendous injustice and a tremendous wrong that has been done to the people that has to be remedied. 1876 was the first consolidation of the Indian Act. It didn't change anything much. 1884 contains some very interesting provisions outlawing the right to free public association, allowing the Superintendent of Indian Affairs to outlaw the sale of ball ammunition. 1884 was the year of starvation in the West. And some people believe and say that it was the last chance to have an indigenous state in North America. There is no indigenous state in North America today. The largest reservations in the United States, the Navajo, but there's no state. But at that time, the people had been talking for quite some time. I know from oral history some accounts of people getting together in great thirst dance ceremonies. One happened south of where Regina is today, around 1870s, where the people were trying to ally to resist the invasion. But it didn't work for all kinds of reasons. One of them you'll recognize in modern military history. An army marches on its stomach. You got to have a lot of food if you're going to have a big army that's going to be moving around for a while. So the 1884-85 time, I think, marks the end of the days of freedom. And you can see it in the amendments of the Indian Act at that time. Prohibition of political meetings, prohibition of the sale of ammunition, and so on. From the 1890s to the 1920s, we have those really repressive and oppressive amendments that prohibit all kinds of spiritual nourishment, that I mentioned earlier on. In 1951, we have the Great Modern Amendment, which did away with all the really, really, really bad prohibitions and no longer outlawed cultural life and ceremonial life of the indigenous people. And a debt is owed to Indian War veterans, because the reason that those worst parts of the Indian Act were removed was because the Indian War veterans wouldn't take that crap when they came back home after having fought overseas. So they influenced the government to make some changes. By the way, it's not only the Indian Act that created some situations and took away rights that would be shocking to the conscience of most Canadians today. There's also the criminal code and elections legislation. Sometimes people mix them all up. The vote, for example, is not very well understood. Other things is the interference with family life. That was done through the Indian Act. Family life, family values, and so on. That was also done through the criminal code. Polygamy, for example. Men were sentenced to jail for having more than one wife. There were Wet'suwet'en killings were outlawed as well. Many ways of controlling the people, killing the spirit. 1985 was one of the modern amendments that's very well known. I'll say nothing about it. What has happened now? The Indian Act is not much amended now. It was amended very recently in something called Bill C-428. Made some small amendments. And the minister is required to report annually to Parliament on how it's dealing with reform of the Indian Act. But I want to say just one or two things about that in conclusion. Something has to replace it. And so, for lack of unanimous agreement on what should replace it, the government is enacting opt-in legislation, which means that bands are provided with the option of adopting other legislation to deal with the administration of life on reserves. But there's one other point I wish to make, which is this. If you believe, as I do, that political action matters, that indigenous political action matters, it matters because in time it creates practices and ultimately laws of the Constitution, the basic law. The basic laws of Canada emerge from political action. And they emerge from the consent of the people. So if people keep attaching their consent or withholding their consent, that is important political action. And this is important for the Indian Act because by continually refusing to tolerate any changes to the Indian Act to which consent is not given, you're creating a constitutional practice that requires that no amendment can be made without the consent of the indigenous people. And this is an important and a fundamental point of constitutional law in Canada. So the political action is of fundamental importance to doing that. And that, I think, is one of the ultimate purposes behind the strategy of the road to Niagara. I heard a young man ask a question this morning. I think I heard him. My hearing is shot. My vision is shot. But I think he was asking about the transition to autonomy or self-government. And I thought my short response might not be all that satisfactory, would be this. There are many roads to freedom. there are many roads to freedom. Those who would walk that road back to freedom, there's only one condition, one essential condition, I think, from my observations. You have to walk that road in the company of Percy. And Percy is perseverance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul Chardran. A lot of interesting information there to digest. We're going to keep moving along. I hope I mentioned this guy's name right, or lady. We're going to be calling upon Rarikutz. Rarikutz. And be speaking about First Nations trust monies.
You snuck over. You're pretty sneaky there. Yeah. Good to meet you. My name's Ryan McKay.
Where's the guy with the slide? Oh, here it is right here. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here, listening to my words. I hope they're useful to you in some way, and that they'll be more than just interesting. I'm going to follow a sort of a script here, but what I'm supposed to talk about is trust money. There is a theory that there is a lot of trust money that's being held in Ottawa that are Indian monies. Next slide. If the treaties had been honored, there would be trust accounts in Ottawa totaling over $2 trillion. That is 2,000 billion dollars. And that it would be drawing an annual interest of $35 billion. But that is if the treaties had been honored. And in that case, there would have been no taxpayer money would have been spent on Indians over the last 150 years because the First Nations people would have their own money. In 1864, when Canada was going to be confederated, there were talks going on in England. There was going to be this super colony, and it was desirous of getting their hands on all of the riches that were in Rupert's Land, where we are right now, and in the Northwest Territories. And so Canada, the John A. Macdonald, those guys, went over to England and asked Queen Victoria, well, just give us those lands and make them a part of our Canada. But Queen Victoria replied to them, sorry, I don't have any rights to those lands. They are not a part of my domain that I can give them to Canada. They may be British in the sense that they're not Spanish or Portuguese or French, but the Queen did not have title to the lands. And this was the reply: we do not have treaties with the tribes and nations who inhabited those lands. You must have their consent. That was the Queen's reply to John A. Macdonald. So they had lots of agreements. They had talks that went back and forth. And this was the agreement that was made. It is understood that any claims of Indians to compensation for lands required for purposes of immigration and settlement shall be disposed of by the Canadian government in communication with the imperial government, and that the company, being the Hudson Bay Company, shall be relieved of all responsibility in respect of them. So the important thing here is they're talking about compensation for lands for immigration and settlement and nothing else. Okay. So they entered into this agreement, which was passed by laws both in Westminster in England and also in the Canadian Parliament in what was known as the Address of 1867. And again, and furthermore, that on the transference of the territories in question, namely Rupert Land in the Northwest Territory, the claims of the Indian tribes to compensation for lands required for purposes of settlement will be considered and settled in conformity with the equitable principles. So, in other words, they couldn't just make any kind of a deal. They had to make a deal that was equitable and which have uniformly governed the British Crown in dealing with the Aborigines. So these were the limitations that were imposed as to the nature of the treaty that had to be signed. It wasn't just any kind of an agreement. There were conditions. So again, listen to the words because they're repeated over and over and over again. Indian title, claims for compensation, lands required for purposes of settlement, conformity with equitable principles, and no mention there of minerals or forests or oil or anything else excepting immigration and settlement. So we see that in the Hansard, which is the transcript of the words that are spoken in Parliament in 1867, was again, they were reading out the agreement that was going to be made, that upon the transference of the territories in question to the Canadian government, the claims of the Indian tribes to compensation for lands required for purposes of settlement. You know, I mean, all of this is written over and over and over again. There's all kinds of documents and evidence. This is not opinion that I'm giving you. I'm just quoting the documents. So this was the handwriting that appears this is from Treaty 2. They've written it all out. It's between, the treaty is not with Canada. The treaty is with the Queen. The word Canada does not appear in the treaty. It's with the Queen of Great Britain and Ireland, and the commissioner was a guy named Wim Simpson, and the Chippewa tribe of Indians. Seeing this, I've heard a number of speakers talking about this earlier, that the treaties are not with First Nations, they're not with little communities scattered here and there, that treaties 1 and 2 were made with the Chippewa tribe of Indians. You know, it's with a nation of people. Now, I know that the Chippewa tribe, the Ojibwe tribe, Soto, whatever word you want to use for it, is larger than treaties 1 and 2. But it was with this larger group rather than with individual communities. So if we're going to go back to honoring the treaties, the demand made against the government can very easily say to the First Nations, well, then you get yourselves together and become the Chippewa tribe, and then we can do it. Okay? Again, the words that the Chippewa tribe of Indians, who are the inhabitants of this country, that are within the limits, and the limits are set out by the treaty. You go from this river to this land, you go over here, you go up there, and so on, and they define the exact precise limits that would be within the treaty. The tract of country bounded and described as hereinafter mentioned, and to obtain
the consent thereto. This was not something that they were going to do anyhow, because they could only do it with consent. You know what consent means, that if you don't get consent, it doesn't happen. And this had already taken place. They had already tried to do a treaty at Rainy River, Fort Francis. And the Ojibwe people of that area said, we're going to think it over the winter. Come back in a couple of years and we'll let you know if we'll enter into the treaty. So there was no treaty because there was a refusal to give consent. This is very, very important. The treaty was for the purpose so that there may be peace and goodwill. This was not like a forced document. It was to have peace and goodwill. That meant that it had to be acceptable all around, and that they may know and be assured of what allowance they are to count upon and receive from Her Majesty, which is the $3 at this time, or the $5. The $5 a year is not without evidence. This is not something your grandfather told you sometime. This is legal evidence that you can take to the court, and there's no evidence to the contrary. Next slide. So anyhow, this goes on, and they talk about makes them a present of $3. A present. This is not payment for the sale of lands. It's a gift from the bountiful benevolence of the Queen. Next. And so this is go ahead, another change. And the interesting thing I find, these are the signatures and so on that are on the treaty document, and it's signed by Archibald Adams, or Adams Archibald, whose name is the one that's smeared up here. But if you go further down, you'll see that present at the treaty is the lieutenant governor's wife and daughter. Now, if this was going to be like a fraudulent document, if the lieutenant governor was there to steal lands from the Chippewa tribe, he would not have brought his wife and daughter along with him to witness a dishonorable act. So I just found this of kind of human interest, that he would have his wife and daughter present to see what a great thing that he was doing. Next. Next. Okay. We have over here, this red spot here is Canada in the year 1867. Your image of Canada is this whole territory. But in 1867, this is Canada. And that's all that's Canada. And in order for Canada to become any larger than that, they had to go into the treaties. As we came in the door, there's a thing about, going back to Niagara. Niagara, the treaties of Niagara were in 1764, and Canada was not even that size at that time. what happened was that the treaties were gradually made, and as the treaties were made, Canada grew. And as Canada grew, the jurisdiction of the Queen was involved. And before the year 1817, what would happen would be that a group of settlers would say, hey, we think we're going to settle in this area. We want to make a treaty with the Indians, and the Queen send over the money to pay them their compensation. And the Queen was sending over the money to pay. And then someone in London got wise and said, hey, how come we're sending the money over to the settlers and they're going to enjoy the benefits of the land? So in 1817, they set up a new arrangement. And the arrangement was that there would not be an advance cash amount paid, because the settlers didn't have that kind of money. Rather, that they would pay a sum of money to obtain the land, and that money would go into a trust account. The trust account, a capital account, would draw interest every year, and then the interest money would be available for the First Nations to use to buy tea for the widows and a blanket for the kids or whatever they needed, some fencing or whatever. And that was the arrangement that was made as of 1817. This is the country as it grew, as the different treaties were signed. Treaty 3, and over here Treaty 8, Treaty 1 down here. Next. And so we end up with this treaty map. And the areas that are hatch marked are the lands that have been surveyed. The lands that are within the boundaries of the treaty, and you can see Treaty 2 here, the dimensions of Treaty 2. And you see all of this land that has no hatch marks. And these are lands within the boundaries of the treaty that were not transferred to the Crown. These were treaties that were retained by the Chippewa tribe for their sustenance and livelihood. They were not in a position to turn everything over, everything that they had depended upon for their livelihood, and everything that their children were going to need for their livelihood. They weren't about to give them away. What they were about to do was to transfer a certain number of lands for immigration and settlement, and the rest of the lands they would be able to keep and hunt, fish, trap, and do everything on. It wasn't a bad deal. At that time, each of these squares is a township. A township is 6 miles by 6 miles. It has about 23,000 acres in it. And every one of those acres was worth $1. And a settler could get a 1 acre of land by paying $1. And you may think that, well, that's not a great amount of money. At that time, it was a fair amount of money. And if that money had gone into that capital account, it would today be worth $934. The first year it'd be $1.06, and the next year it'd be $1.12, and the next year, and so on and so on and so on. But it gradually grows as the money is paid on an annual basis. And that would be, you can calculate it yourself, that if you deposit $1 at 6% interest in 1871, that today that dollar would be worth in the neighborhood of $934. And that's how that figure of trillions of dollars that would be in the bank, because for every acre here, that dollar would have gone in, and we'll see how much is involved here. Next slide. So, 20th of December, 1870, Adams Archibald has been sent out from, he's from Nova Scotia, He's in Ottawa for a while as a member of Parliament, and he's sent out here to be lieutenant governor. He realizes that he is going to have to do treaties. And going through his papers in Ottawa, in the archives, I found that he had hand-copied a stack of treaties about that thick. There must have been 400 pages of copies of treaties from the United States, from Canada, every treaty that he could get his hands on. And they didn't have photocopiers at that time. They were all hand-copied. And he had copies of that because he knew he was going to have to do a treaty, so he had to know how you do it. He brought in all of these examples. And so he goes through this of sending this report back to Ottawa. Go ahead. And he goes through everything. He measures it out. He talks about the Selkirk Tract and how that's going to work. And then he says the sum so named from this $1 an acre would furnish a fund sufficiently ample not only to defray the cost of administration, but to discharge the obligations that we would be obliged to something in extinguishing the Indian title. In other words, if this money had been deposited in the bank, it would have covered all the expenses not only of the First Nation, but it also would have paid the cost of administering Indian affairs. And that's why the capital account had a 10% surcharge that was paid to the government for administering the account. This is going to be a good deal. The price would be no impediment in the way of settlers. The moment the land system is adopted, there will be a rush of immigrants to this country. The difficulty will be not to induce them to come, but to be ready for them when they come. So this was the arrangement that was going to be made. Next slide. So we have these myths that we have to deal with today. Did the treaty deal with resources? No. Immigration and settlement and nothing else. Every tree that has been cut on these lands are First Nation trees. Any mines, any mineral, any oil, all of that is First Nation, and it has never been treated for. It's not a part of the treaty. It's still owned by the First Nations. Did they just give away the land? Of course they didn't. They were to get compensation for it. The treaty called for the dollar that was to be used for each acre. Was the treaty for land that could be for any purpose? No. The treaty was for the sole purpose of immigration and settlement. So we're going to skip now to slide 78. So this is the arrangement, and these are the myths, and people really need to get their heads around this because people have grown up thinking about treaty in a very different way. Another slide, 78. There isn't? No, there should be. There we go. No, one more. Next. That's all? Okay, so I'll just pick up from there. We have this situation. If I went outside right now and came back in, running in and saying, hey, a truck just smashed into your car. He destroyed your car. I got his license number. I got a photograph of him. Here's a list of 10 witnesses that I have. What would you do? Would you tell me, well, that's very interesting information? No. You would want action. Give me those lists. Call the police. Go to the courts. You see? But the problem that we have is that we're so caught in another way of thinking that when I tell you there's all this evidence just sitting there, don't reply by saying, oh, that's very interesting. You see, nothing's going to happen until you do something about it. Get your heads around this information, check over the evidence, make sure it's there, and if it is, do something about it. This is the important thing to understand about this fraud. Now, there are two frauds that have been committed by the government. What happened? Why isn't that money in the bank? The answer is that John A. MacDonald gave it all away. He gave it to the settlers. They didn't pay any money. He gave it to the Métis. He gave it to all kinds of people, to Hutterites, to Mennonites, to people from Iceland. You know, he gave it away. And he could give it away if he bought it first. If he paid that $1 an acre, he can give it to anyone he wants that's going to be there for immigration and settlement. See? So this is the problem that we have, and we need to deal about it. One can say, well, what's the evidence here? I mean, you know, can't that treaty be interpreted in a different way? This is from a ruling of the Supreme Court of Canada, that an honorable interpretation of an obligation of the Crown cannot be a legalistic one that divorces the words from their purpose. The honor of the Crown demands that constitutional obligations to Aboriginal people be given a broad, purposive interpretation. This is the Supreme Court of Canada. So this is the way that your case would be dealt with if it ever gets to the court. So that is basically what I have to tell you. If anyone wants a copy of the documents, we skipped over a whole bunch of stuff because I only have 20 minutes here. But I'd be happy to send it to you. You can use it however you want. This is going to be a long battle. Make sure your children understand it and tell them to teach their children about it so that you keep this going until you finally win. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
If anyone has any questions, ask me later.
Just a very quick question for Rory. The question around the treaty trusts. Now, Canada has a credit rating that's internationally recognized, and that credit rating is established, I believe, every year, every couple of years, based on valuations done on Canada's spending. Out of I think there's firms out of New York that provide Canada's credit rating. Now, what if Indigenous people started bringing questions forward with respect to the historical data that you provided, challenging Canada's credit rating on the basis of these trusts that have been eliminated or ignored or squandered? What kind of impact would that have on Canada's credit rating, if any?
I'm not sure I fully heard or understood the question. If I could just finish one thought I had, there were two frauds. The first fraud was that you didn't get payment for the land, and the second fraud is that the money went to wealthy people and the taxpayer is left with the bill. See, so there were two frauds. Who got the benefit out of these lands? The railroad companies, the oil companies, the timber companies are the ones with the benefit. Can you just give me the last part of your question, please?
I think that when we reflect upon how Canada represents its financial standing to the international community.
Oh, yes.
Now, if you frame it within the context of how Canada represents its international standing financially, as you had said, the wealth of the land was robbed from us, and payment hasn't been received, by Indigenous people for the wealth of the land that was taken. Now, if Indigenous people began to challenge Canada's financial standing would that have an impact on Canada's
Okay,
credit rating?
I hear you. There is not enough money in Canada to pay what they owe to the First Nations. There is not enough money. So that means that you're going to have to enter into negotiations about this, and you're going to have to raise the very question that Grand Chief is raising, that if you put this in the Winnipeg Free Press tomorrow morning that you're going to sue for, all of this money, who would want to invest in Manitoba? In fact, if you're a foreign investor, who would want to invest in Canada? Because it is going to have that economic effect that it's going to kill the Canadian economy. And of course, you depend upon the Canadian economy and you're going to suffer for it. But this is the time to approach the politicians, to approach the Prime Minister, approach the premiers, and approach Canadians generally and say, we got a big problem here and we're going to have to work together to solve it. And what we want is, and then put out what you want to get today and, keep getting that until you get it. I think that this has to be done very strategically and very carefully. And I would like to see a meeting of you, Grand Chief, with the Premier in which you talk about this issue and say, Premier, what do you want to do about it? And let's work together in solving this problem. They've had their way long enough.
Thank you, Let's again, that information, I'm pretty sure, I want to request that PowerPoint slide from him, so I'm pretty sure that he's going to get a lot of requests for that slide. Stop him before he leaves. Next up, I'm going to call on Tasha Spillett, and she's going to be discussing youth perspective, decolonizing the mind, body, and spirit. Are you going to hold it, or you want it in there?
I'm just going to write down, just yell at people,
Okay.
just yell at everyone for 20 minutes. Thank you. How are you guys doing today? Still good? Wache, wapi umameo square nitigasun, wapi masquando dem, ininoe quinina, quitnawe oche, wakasko oche. Give you all of that to contextualize some of the understandings that I'd like to share with you all this afternoon, to create relationality, but also to model what it means to decolonize the mind. So to me, when I first think of decolonization, I see it as being a very individual journey to begin with. I see it as an acknowledgement that this work doesn't start with me or the people that I occupy this place in the circle with, but represents a piece of a bundle that has been passed down to us through the continual line of ancestors since time before memory that has kept our people alive. And if we do our job, we'll continue to keep our people alive. I recognize that I'm very young. I have a lot of learning to do about life and a lot of learning to do about living. And to be honest, I hope I say those same words when I'm a grandmother. What I have to offer you this afternoon, if it can be useful to you in your journey, you're welcome to carry it. And if it's not useful at this time, you're welcome to leave it here as well. And that's okay with me. When I vision about what decolonization means, I imagine that it would look like all of our relatives coming home to our circle again. I imagine that it looks like putting together the pieces of the puzzle that have somehow been lost or put down or taken away, hidden in different parts of our own history. From my mother and my aunties, I know that as a woman, as a Cree woman, I have the sacred right to manifest creation within my own body. I know that when the time comes and I choose to do that, as a woman of color, as an indigenous woman living within the confines of a colonial state, that manifesting creation in my body by having children will be my most beautiful, powerful, biggest act of resistance. I know that if I have sons, I want to raise them to be men who understand that to be a warrior is to have a big heart, and that to be a warrior means to operate from a source of unconditional love and to serve the people from that love. If I have daughters, I want to raise women who understand that their role in our community surpasses that of lifting blankets over the shoulders of INAC chiefs. I want them to understand and to operate in the understanding that they themselves are who will keep our nations moving forward. I have the privilege of working with young people and learners in my job as an educator at the university. Some of who I brought with me here today. Wave, you guys. What makes my heart most happy is working with young people and looking at land-based education. And although I recognize and I celebrate that our resistance, our resilience, our decolonization is based on the premise that we return to the land, it makes me sad when we construct that it's only that it somehow exists outside of the urban setting. If we do that, what we're doing is we're marginalizing our relatives who, because of poverty, can't leave urban setting. We're not acknowledging the fact that underneath all this concrete is still our mother. And so part of land-based education, part of land defense, is reclaiming these spaces, urban spaces, as our territories. Something that resonates with me, something that I get from my mom, something that she raised me to believe and act upon, is that we didn't give up a single inch, that we didn't cede a single inch of our territory. And so that's something when I think of, if I can give anything to the young people that I work with, it will be that understanding. I also know that language is really powerful. I know that words are medicine and words can be used to hurt or to heal, and that's something that we have the agency to decide on how our words will impact our relatives. I know that we have the power, we have the sovereignty to talk about our relatives and to identify our relatives in a way that is outside how the Indian Act would define who we are. I know that my indigeneity is not defined by a piece of plastic that may or may not be present in my wallet. And I refuse to accept that my nationhood is about that. Because my nationhood will be about how I honor my responsibility to you all as relatives. If we can do anything to move our nations forward, it will be that, to act as relatives. There's a lot of talk right now around pipelines, and a lot of these discussions are happening outside of circles that will impact, or without the engagement of the people that they will impact the most. Without the engagement of young people. To me, that's like the most disgraceful thing, to be honest. How can we have these discussions without the people who will inherit the outcome of our work? Young people have a right to sound their voices if their elected leadership is signing the death certificates of their unborn children. Weeks ago, my heart broke for our relatives in the West as we watched their territory burn to the ground. And I was talking to our regional chief this morning, and he was saying, you know, Tasha, they were calling that fire the beast. And that made me really angry because fire isn't a beast. Fire is a relative of ours, a spirit that comes to tell us something, to deliver a message. It's on us whether or not we listen. What is the beast is our insatiable greed. Resource extraction is the beast. The colonial project is the beast. And so what we need to be doing is discerning where we are going to point our arrows and then acting in accordance to that decision. I would be amiss if I didn't talk about that the last time I was in this space was for the wake of my niece. And statistics would say that, statistics would tell her story as being an Indigenous youth who took her life. You know, and I know my girl, she was beautiful, and she had so much more to give to our circle. She had so much more to offer. And so although I know that her life and death will be marked in the statistics that Canada takes about our people, I don't see her as being just that. I see her for her humanity. I also acknowledge that, you know, my girl was a casualty of a war that continues to be waged by the Canadian state on our bodies, on our mind, and on our territories. These things are all connected. They're all interconnected. We can't talk about decolonization unless we talk about resource extraction. We can't talk about decolonization unless we talk about youth suicide, unless we talk about, and please hear me, unless we talk about the particularly violent manifestation that patriarchy has in our communities, unless we talk about homophobia. These are all things interwoven. If we're going to find a way out, we need to be looking at all of the picture and not just things in certain silos. This is about our life, and our action is about asserting the truth that we have a right to live as sovereign people on our territories. I know that one day, I hope it will be like my greatest privilege of one day I can sit with my own grandchildren. And I know I'll have the responsibility of answering to them. I'll have to answer questions like, what were you doing when they tried to push the pipeline through our territory? Where were you when the lullaby of reconciliation endeavored to put our people back to sleep again? And all I know is that if I do anything in my life, it will be to have an answer that is worthy of them. And so I leave you with that. Kakyaw Newagamanganak.
Thank you very much, Ms. Spillett. Good friend of mine. Got me all riled up now. We're going to keep cruising because we're running a little behind. Our next speaker is Mr. Leonard Monkman. He's going to also discuss youth perspective, but he's going to be talking about reclaiming First Nations governance.
Bonjour. I guess I got to follow that up. Thank you, Tasha. It was beautiful. So at Bonjour, Leonard Monkman, Indigenous Cause, Zanamuzi, Bing Dunji, Winnipeg Dunji. I just want to say thank you to Derek Nepanak and the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs for inviting me to have these conversations and acknowledge that, you know, we are on Treaty 1 territory, and thinking about how this is home. I've never ever looked at it any other way. Whether we're in the city, whether we're in the country, whether we're on the highways, this has always been home. And that's my connection to this place, is that regardless of where I am, it always feels like home regardless of where I'm at. Whether it be inside of the building or whether it be outside at a sweat lodge, it doesn't matter, it's always home. So one of the questions, I'm going to have a lot of questions, and I want people to think about them and to have conversations. A lot of the things that I feel like I've picked up over the last few years has been a a combination of reading books, but also having conversations with people all over the place. So one of the questions that I wanted to pose to people is, Canadians, Aboriginal people, non-status, status, Métis, Anishinaabe, where do you identify yourself on that spectrum? Are you a Canadian? Are you an Aboriginal? Are you a non-status Indian? Are you Anishinaabe? For me, I wasn't an Indian, I wasn't recognized as an Indian up until last summer. The government finally recognized me as an Indian. But I had been an Indian this whole time, an Anishinaabe person, through the teachings that were passed on through me from my grandma. I never needed the government to say to me, you're an Indian. I've lived my whole life this way. I've always been this person. That day that I was recognized as an Indian was the same day. I still felt the same after that. I was the same person before that, and I'm still the same person today. So what we do is we acknowledge that we're on Treaty 1 territory. You go to the football games these days, they'll say, welcome to Treaty 1 territory. We acknowledge that we're on Treaty 1 territory. One of the questions that I would have liked to ask people here today is really, if the settler states say that we acknowledge we're on Treaty 1 territory, what does that mean for people? It means that when we signed these treaties, we had the agreement that we were going to be in the same canoes and respecting each other's jurisdictions and respecting each other's place. And for me, I don't think of it as being radical politics to say that I don't identify with being a Canadian and that I identify with being Anishinaabe first. One of the things that happened over the last couple of months, and it was a little bit controversial for a lot of people, Occupy INAC kicked off a lot of different things. We all know what the problems are. I could come up here and give you a history lesson on all of these things of colonization, the Indian Act, suicides. That's been discussed all morning. It's been discussed all day. It's been discussed for the last 150 years. So we take into consideration everything that has happened in the past and put it into where we're at right now and what are we going to do moving forward. And that's my line of thinking, is that we can sit here and talk about everything that has happened in the past and acknowledge that. And let's acknowledge the work that all of these people have done. These guys have made it specific careers to, be a public policy analyst, to be, legal academics, scholars, activists, all of these other different things. We'll acknowledge that, but let's put it into where we're at right now. Occupy INAC, suicide crises in Cross Lake, suicide crisis in Attawapiskat. When they occupied that building, I was thinking to myself, you know what, this is a fresh energy for me. I was on house arrest when Idle No More was kicking off. My background is the effects of colonization and everything that the North End has to offer. I've experienced that. I've experienced what it's like to live on the res. So with Occupy INAC, instead of going out and saying, you know what we're going to do, we're going to abolish the Indian Act, they took it one step further and they said, we're going to abolish the treaties. That was probably the most controversial statement that has happened in Indian country this year, to say that we're going to abolish the numbered treaties. So regardless of however you feel about that, instead of it being, we're going to, this is going to be my paradigm shift right here. So on the one hand, you've got Canadian identity and mainstream politics, and on the other hand, you've got nationalism and the idea of nationhood and what that means for us. We could stop right here and say we're going to abolish the Indian Act, but what these guys did was they said we're going to abolish the treaties, and bang, they take it towards nationhood. So regardless of however you feel about them saying that they're going to abolish the treaties, what they did was they opened up the door to have conversations about nationhood, because what they're talking about is restoration of old traditional governance systems. And if you were to ask people, what does decolonization mean to you? You're going to get a different answer from every single person. And I think a lot of people can agree that we would like to see change within our communities. For the majority of Indigenous students that go to university, They would like to better their lives, they would like to better their families, and they would like to better their communities. How do we get there? Everybody is going to have a different approach on how to get there. So, this weekend, the Liberal Convention was in the city. One of the things that they talked about was introducing a new policy to frame a discussion on a new First Nations governance law and having the input from Indigenous peoples to implement that. So if we wait around and we don't have these discussions, these are laws that are going to be affecting my kids, your guys' kids, and it's going to be implemented the same way that everything else has been implemented for us. And we've always come to the table underhanded. We've always come to the table underhanded because we haven't been able to organize ourselves politically. And what Occupy INAG did was, it really opened up the door for nationhood, because what we have the opportunity to do here, and the things that I've been seeing and the conversations that I've been having, is that we have the potential and the building blocks being set up in place right now to start establishing our nationhood. And it's really going to differ depending on who you have these conversations with. And that's why I'm glad that Tasha left her class here still, because for me, the most important thing is getting these ideas to the youth. You know, what does the nation actually look like if we are able to incorporate our spiritual leaders, our elders, the men, the women, the youth, the two-spirited community? Our community is so much stronger if we have everybody in the room at the same time sharing our ideas and allowing these ideas to take into actuality. I woke up this morning and I was looking outside and I was thinking to myself, you know, I've had these conversations over and over and over again with people, and it's sort of like people say, well, that's going to be utopian thinking. You're thinking outside of the box. How are you going to actualize these ideas where we're not fully 100% buying into the idea that we're all Canadians? If you were to ask my son, what are you? Are you Canadian or are you Anishinaabe? He'll tell you. You know, how do we get the youth to believe that we can be on that part of the spectrum where we can self-govern and self-determine who we are as people? One of the things that has happened over the past year too is that I've watched the discourse happening. I noticed that there was an elderly lady here that was sitting here this morning that said, where are our chiefs? Where are the leaders within our communities? How come they're not sitting here at these tables? And it's the status quo that exists. Why would anybody want to take out their own job? They do not see it as what it could be. They're not thinking outside of the box because they're worried about what their salary is right now. And it's really, how do we get our own people to say that we're going to believe in nationhood? We're going to believe in these discussions. It's the same thing with the Liberal Convention policy, where they're going to take a policy and they're going to implement it for us. And if you know, one of the questions that I ask myself is, if we're working to abolish the Indian Act, what's going to replace it? Are we going to be the ones that are fulfilling the white paper? Are we going to be, you know what, everyone's going to say, well, we need to go back to the land and we need to do this and we need to do that. But then we need to take into consideration where we're at right now in 2016. I need to feed my kids. My family is not going back to the land anytime soon. A lot of the things that we need to consider. So last time that I spoke at Bannock and Tea Dialogues, what we were talking about was sovereignty and what sovereignty meant to me from an urban perspective, from an urban Indigenous perspective. And when we go into nationhood and we start thinking about different aspects and what our nationhood actually looks like, for me, one of the first things that we need to figure out is membership. Who is a member of our nation? How do we define that? Do we work off of what Indian Affairs already has? Do we have their ban lists? And can we add to that list? You know, how do we determine who our leadership is? Well, we talked about, I heard a little bit about the clan systems and having the grandmas being able to decide who is going to be representative of who. For me, my grandma was the matriarch of our family. She was the leader of our family. And we talk about what Indigenous law was. We've had these conversations with Kevin Satie and talking about the lodges and growing up in the sweat lodges and stuff like that. And for me, in my family, the law was always my grandma. My grandma was the law. Whatever she said went. There was no questions asked. You did what you had to do, and that was it. There's no questions. She was the law. So another conversation that we need to have is food sovereignty. How are we going to be able to feed ourselves? Food sovereignty is a huge part of that discussion with all of these climate change discussions, all of these different things happening. Capitalism itself, I believe, will eventually fold itself because we're not going to be prepared to be able to handle all of these different things. That's why it's important for people like Tasha to say, you know what, 50 years from now, they're going to ask you, where were you when these pipelines were going to go through? Where did you stand on these issues? And if you're not taking that stand and you're not a part of these conversations, how is that going to look if we can't feed ourselves or if we don't have the knowledge to be able to feed ourselves? So lately this year, it's been nice to be able to connect with the elders and learn from their teachings and to be able to have these conversations all over the place. Education. I was thinking about some of the things that Isaac and Christy Belcourt are proposing, and I really feel like some of the ideas that they have are very revolutionary. Isaac is saying, you know what we need to do? We need to take our kids right out of the Canadian education system and raise them on the land and immerse them in the languages and teach them about the medicines and give them all of the old Anishinaabe teachings. And that's a really revolutionary idea, in my opinion. I don't know if we're fully there for that. Another thing that we wanted to talk about was leadership and fluidity. Our communities are always changing. Our people are always moving around doing different things. The idea that, we need to be able to insert the idea of rotational leadership so that it's not just one person that represents all of us, but rather we have a whole bunch of people that specialize in these different fields, where if we want to talk to a lawyer, we've got the best lawyer over here. If we want to talk to somebody about the environment, we've got the best environmentalist over here. If we want to talk about teachings, we've got that for you over here. And all of these different people they're professionals. They're the best at what they do. That's who you're going to talk to at that particular moment. And it's really, that's the idea of rotational leadership, is that our people are extremely gifted. A lot of our people bring something different to the table. How do we get our own people to realize and recognize that, and to not only recognize that, but to nurture it? I went to my old high school last week, and one of the things that he was saying was, Leonard, you used to be a pain in the ass when I was in school. And I said, yeah, I'm getting paid for that now. So thinking about, for me, I'm not that, I get caught up in thinking about the future a lot and what the future for our people, what it holds. And, there is nothing more that I would like to see than to see our people being healthy. I think it all boils down to health. How do we lift our people out of the problems that you see inside the city? How do you lift your people out of the problems that they see on the reserve? How do we deal with these suicide crises? How do we deal with poverty and hunger and stuff like that? And it's really, there's so much different approaches on how to get there, but it's thinking about things through a clan system lens, to recognize that not everybody has the same gift, or not everybody has the same ideals on how to be able to get to that point where we're restoring our nation and we're also restoring health to our communities, but that we can come together when it's time to come together and really decide what the future of our people is going to look like. So if we're going to wait around and not be ready for the Indian Act to be abolished, and we're not a part of these conversations, it doesn't bode well for our future. We need to get our youth involved and to get them to start thinking about nationhood. You know, last weekend was a real good example of everybody being all starstruck and getting their selfies in. And for me, these people are just people to me. You know, how do we elevate each other? How do we boost each other? For so long, we've had this monopoly of information that has been withheld from us, and we get to share with each other. The thing that happened with Idle No More is that monopoly on information was finally removed, and every single day we are able to share information amongst each other. So you don't have to go to university to be able to read up on this information. You can pull these lectures off of the internet. You can learn from each other, and that's what we're doing right now. We're sharing information and thinking about you know, how do we influence each other and how do we shape our decisions. We could use technology to be able to really shift the consciousness of Canadians, Indigenous people. This magazine right here, Red Rising, made for us, by us, and we really want to be able to share these ideas. So right now what we're doing is we're building capacity amongst each other to share these ideas, to use it as a communication tool so that we could get to the youth to start thinking about something different, to start thinking about a little bit more about, to start thinking critically about their identity as Canadians or Anishinaabe people. I kind of wanted to go a little bit past rhetoric. We sit here and we talk about the same thing, and a lot of people know this kind of information. For me, I would, you know, decolonization, what does that mean for me? For me, it's trying to go back to the ceremonies and learn all of these different teachings and trying to incorporate that traditional knowledge with the things that I know and with the experiences that I've been through personally. So, the future. How do we build our nationhood? I thought that this would be a good example of one of the first steps. It's obviously not the first step, but it's a step. The road to Niagara could be used as an 8-day conversation where if you get people to sit down and brainstorm together, you really need to have people that have been thinking about it. I joined in a conversation last week with Christy Belcourt online where we're talking about abolishing the Indian Act. And for me, this is something that I think about all of the time. There's very few things that are more passionate to me than Indigenous politics. How do we get the youth involved in that? So the road to Niagara could be used as a way to brainstorm, to get people on board across on the way there, but also to develop a game plan / strategy. What needs to happen is that we need to be able to figure out a working group that's going to be able to put these ideas into action. You know, and part of the reason why I woke up this morning and I was doubtful is because they're all ideas. But what turns it around is that you have to believe in your ideas, or if you don't believe in your ideas, nobody else is going to believe in your ideas. For me, I believe in Indigenous nationhood and nationalism. We need a group that will be able to take on this work full time. So another important thing that I wanted to talk about was jurisdiction and the urgency that exists to have these conversations right now. My son is non-status. My daughter is non-status. I was non-status for 30 years. But if we wait for another 50 years, it's going to look different. How do we establish jurisdiction on our own lands and our own territories? And if we don't have these conversations about what it's going to look like in the future, are we still going to be able to assert jurisdiction? One of the examples that I learned this year was Grassy Narrows and all of the clear cutting and forest development that was happening over there. And they have one of the longest standing blockades in Canadian history. I think they're going on 17 years. And one of their ideas was to, Indian Affairs wanted them to build cabins in a certain area, but they said, you know what, no, that's not our traditional territory, and we're not going to do that on this reserve. We're going to move outside of this reserve, and we're going to establish a cabin on our traditional territory. So it's something as simple as building cabins to establish jurisdiction on your traditional territory as a way of saying, this is where we live, and this is our space, and we're going to occupy this space, and we don't need permission to do that if you're recognizing our title over the land. You know, the age of reconciliation. Where are we at with reconciliation? Is it just a whitewashing of history and all of these things that everybody has talked about this morning? If you were to equal up all of the reserves in Canada combined, it only equals 0.2% of the total landmass of Canada. Real reconciliation is not about money, it's about land. It's about land. Real reconciliation. Why not use that term reconciliation to say, you know what? We want more land. We want the ability to be able to determine what is going to happen on that land. If you wanted to say, you know what? I'll use this as an example. We're going to build a casino over here. We're going to do uranium mining. You know what I mean? That's a crazy example, but that's saying, how do we build our own economic development? Economic development really needs to be a part of the conversation as well, just thinking about in terms of where we're at. Another idea that I had in terms of, you know, how do we continue to build? There's a lot of different conversations on energy and how do we shift away from fossil fuels? How do we divest? How do we get more people employed? Renewable energy. Why are our people not at the forefront of these discussions for renewable energy? And how do we get our people into these positions? If this is a new frontier and everybody else is learning it at the same time, why are we not being able to get our people in there to learn at exactly the same time as everybody else? For me, that's a sort of environmental justice for jobs and stuff like that. So I'll finish it off with a quote. I like this quote since we've been talking about the Indian Act all day. It's from Brian Rice, who's a professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Winnipeg. And he says, if you want to study the Indian Act, you can become an expert on government policy as it pertains to Indians, and you may become a perpetual victim. If you study your language, culture, and history, you'll become an expert on Indigenous knowledge and become empowered. What we need to do is move past all of the rhetoric and all of these discussions on the past and start thinking more about the future, start putting a game plan together, start getting the younger people involved, start bringing the Two-Spirit people involved, start gathering the elders, start gathering the clan mothers, start building our people, and really use that information. What we should be doing right now is having these discussions and saying, you know what, we need to showcase to our youth that there's a different set of politics. There's two types of politics emerging in our community. One is joining the mainstream and saying we need to become at the table or whatever, and the other one is our own tables. I call them determination tables. Everyone calls them termination tables. I call them determination tables because we'll determine what's going to happen for our future. If we're not thinking about it for ourselves, just let things happen and we'll continue on with the status quo. So thank you very much for letting me share. Also too, if any of you young guys, if any of you the youth want the magazine, you guys can come see me. If any of the older people want to purchase, it's pay what you can model. But any of the youth that are interested in the magazine, feel free to grab one off me.
Thank you very much, Leonard. Tasha and Leonard are still here. If anybody wanted to ask them questions, quick, fast. Question? Grand Chief has a question.
Miigwech, I've witnessed the ongoing evolution of the discussion around tar sands expansion and pipeline expansion, which is the same thing, because if you put pipelines in, the tar sands expand, and it doesn't matter which way those pipelines go, they're going to create greater greenhouse gas emissions towards the eventual conclusion that we won't be able to live on the surface of the planet any longer. The evolution of the discussion, I think, needs to be brought forward because we need to talk about how do we engage one another appropriately from the deconstructed spaces that we can potentially create to have a real and true discussion. Because you see, what's happening is our communities are being captured. They're being captured because of the poverty that persists within our communities. And the leadership in our communities are looking for opportunity, not because they're trying to make a bunch of money from themselves, but because we want to create economics within our communities so that there's jobs created and so that there's ways of I guess, existing, perhaps outside of poverty. And when that kind of dynamic is created, you end up with the false dichotomy of environment versus economy. And that spins a whole nother different type of discussion, which inevitably results in a lot of negativity and fighting. I think the challenge that I've observed is that we have a government now that has recognized that there is a duty to consult Indigenous people. They've approached me. Industry has approached me in the past and offered money to the organization, which we haven't accepted and at any time. And now government has come back to the table saying we want to give you money because we believe that you represent communities of people that will be impacted by pipeline expansion, specifically the Line 3 replacement out of a place called Hardisty, Alberta, coming through Saskatchewan into Manitoba and into a place called Gretna into the United States. So they're putting money on the table saying we want to consult, but as has been raised here today, our youth aren't at these tables. They're not hearing what's being put out and through the political organizations for discussions. And I, for one, would like to know, how do we expand the scope of the discussion? I've sat with the National Energy Board chairman. I've sat with the National Energy Board. I've formed alliance on the other side of the mountains. I've done everything I could to be public and to be accessible through social media, speaking to the media, and trying to draw a broader awareness to what's happening here. Always keeping in mind that there is, I believe, an effort to keep some of these discussions isolated and beyond the public's view, because the economics are moving through the pipeline corridor. And the economics are about, I believe, buying consent of the communities because of the poverty that's there. Now, I would like a youth perspective to tell me, how do we get past this? How do we open up the discussion so that everybody can stand and say, you know what, we don't want this to happen. And we need that message to resonate right across the land. I know that Terry Duguid and Minister McKenna were here last week to have a community consultation for Winnipeg. But what about the original people? What about the Indigenous people? And I know that community consultation flows from the climate change action plan that Prime Minister Trudeau announced in Vancouver. I was at the First Minister's meeting when he did that, but we were somewhat left out of that discussion as the original people. We had, I believe, 5 or 10 minutes through the one voice of the AFN chief, which didn't carry the message that we brought from Manitoba to that forum. So it's a very impoverished dialogue right now, is what I'm getting at. And I need some direction in terms of, how do I open this discussion up? How do I go to the chiefs and explain that we need to open up this discussion? Because as Tasha had said, and she said it very powerfully, it's our young generation that's going to inherit the decisions we make today. So, we wish.
I think with issue 3, we dedicated the issue to land and water issues. And in the featured article, we had Christy Belcourt talk about, is Justin Trudeau the best Prime Minister for Canada's Indigenous people? Yes. Is he the best for probably the history of Canada? Yes. Is he going to probably be the best Prime Minister for Indigenous people? Yes. Are the pipelines still going to go through? Yes. These problems will still continue regardless of whatever government is in there. And with this, we're taking, the front cover of it says soil, not oil. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to use our own media, which you're not going to be able to find anywhere else. We have our own communication strategy. How do we make Indigenous resurgence politics cool or at least knowledgeable to the younger people? We do that by getting them to where they're at. The thing with Indigenous people, and the thing that I've come to recognize, is that our people are connected online every single day. And it's the reason why things like CBC Aboriginal exist, and it's the reason why, the opportunities for Indigenous media need to be there. and especially independent Indigenous media so that you can really be critical. One of the things that I forgot to talk about during mine is that we need to have an independent body that is allowed to truly advocate and be vocal on whatever issues are affecting us. And how would we have a group like Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs be a legitimate representative body of the people, where our people are identifying leadership, and it's not just the Indian Act chiefs? Because if you were to look around the room today, there is no Indian Act leadership here today. It's really just a bunch of grassroots people. How do we get our people in our communities to be more vocal? What we're trying to do is continue that awakening process that happened with Idle No More, where people are waking up to certain ideas, and how do we shift the consciousness of our own people? And we really need to do that by continuing to be vocal, by continuing to share with each other. And, media stories, and you said it earlier, like arts. The arts allows us to share and innovate ideas, but also to inspire each other. And I think that's the biggest thing with Red Rising, is that, we're filling in a gap where it hasn't always existed for us. Whereas if Tasha has a story, I'm not going to write Tasha's story for her. Tasha's going to write that story for herself. And that's exactly what we need. But we need to have it on a platform that reaches a whole lot of people, so that we have these mass communication strategies that when something is happening, this is where you can go for real news. This is where you can go for alternative news, that you're not going to get that filter down. But it's an awakening process. We need to really push forward with ideas of nationhood. We need to have it be political. We need to have it be environmental. We need to be able to showcase whenever our people are doing good. The thing that I say is that brown people like to see brown people doing good things. A lot of people will grab onto that. We can talk about the most depressing stuff, and that doesn't change anything that we're doing. But, when we're talking to the youth, you never really know who's being inspired by the work that you do. If you're standing in a room full of 100 people, or if you're the best artist, or if you're a really great powwow dancer, you never really know who you're inspiring in the crowd. And we need to be able to showcase that to the rest of society. We need to be able to showcase that to ourselves. So I do think that having, a medium like Red Rising, where we're on the web, where our people are at, and we have the ability to share ideas, and that's what needs to happen. Is we need to feel comfortable with sharing our ideas, and we need to be comfortable and make the language accessible, right? So one of the problems with academia is that when people from universities speak, they speak in a language that nobody understands. We need to be able to share this information so that our aunties and uncles will understand it back home in the res.
I had to get my students off for their bus, so I think that I got the most of your question, Grand Chief. One thing that I think is important for anyone's engagement is to meet people where they're at. It's almost not enough to say, this is where we are and we invite you. I know for young people, it's about going to where they take up space, spending time with them and wherever they're comfortable, and then bringing them in. Most of my education didn't come, I hold 3 degrees from universities, but the breadth of my own education didn't come from a classroom in a university. It came from trailing behind my mom, It came from being engaged in these conversations while I was coming up as a little one. And that's why I bring young people with me where I go, because today I wasn't just their teacher. You were all their teacher. This circle was their teacher. And that's so much more than I can do on my own. And so that's what I think, where I think youth engagement should be at. It's also okay for young people to be mad. And I think that anger and rage is not something that we should squash in young people all the way. Because, to be honest, with what's going on in our communities, it's a natural response to be angry. It's a human response to be angry. And that's something that I think that we need to hone in a positive direction, but not an energy that we need to dismiss. It will be young people. In every generation, it has been young people to move things forward. It's our job at some point to stay out of their way, to say, how can I help you? How can I assist you to move things forward? The young people that I had, the way that they will do their work on behalf of our nations will not be how we have done our work. And that's how it's supposed to be, because they were given different times to live in. Creator has given them a different vision. They have different tools to work with. It's our job to say, I have your back, and when the time comes, I will feel well enough to step aside and follow your leadership.
Jimmy Gretsch.
I'll wrap it up really. Oh, you got one more question? Okay. I don't think so.
Hello?
Yeah. You can use the mic.
Okay, so if we want to stop the pipeline, we have to be louder than the oil and gas industry that's lobbying really hard right now to make sure that the pipeline goes through. And that's why the powers that be just waffle when you ask them if they're going to say no, because right now the pressure is coming from the oil and gas, and we need to be the ones putting on all the pressure.
I just wanted to finish up with what Jason was saying. One of the things that really needs to happen, and like I'm glad that these conversations continue, but we need our people to really be proud to be who they are, to say that, you know what, we're going to establish nationhood instead of identifying with political parties. The same way that people identify with political parties, we need to be able to identify with nationhood. We need to be able to take, you know, just to be happy with being Anishinaabe, to say, okay, well, we're going to reestablish our nationhood, and to get our youth need to really, I was going to say buy into these ideas. But they really need to get these ideas on the table and say, you know what, we believe in it. We need to actualize it. We need to, you know what, use what we have at our disposal, whether that's video, internet, social media, all of these different things. But we need to really continuously be proud to continue these discussions. So media does have a good strategy in that sense.
Hello. My name is Charles Whitecap. I'm from Shoal Lake Cree Nation in Saskatchewan, Treaty 5. I'm just going to be brief, and I'm just going to cover some, you know, the day before treaty, the day during treaty, and the day after treaty, but more so the day after. And I guess, you know, if you're wanting to proceed and advance, you got to try and understand what type of governance models are available. And to my knowledge, there's 5. First is the Tier 1, and that's being, you know, identified through the RCAP report, where the Crees get together, or the Deni get together and assert their sovereignty and jurisdiction. And the other one is Tier 2, and that's kind of more or less, you know, municipal style of governance, and I wouldn't recommend that. And the third one is First Nations law without Crown's recognition. That's doing internal legislation like establishing your Constitution, your Governance Act, your Election Act, and all acts. But at the end, it might create undue hardship for your membership. But in part, you can use that on a later model that I will mention. The fourth one is First Nations law within Crown recognition. And that's your contribution style of funding, you know, the contribution agreements, ICFS, and I wouldn't recommend that either. And the fifth one is First Nations law under the Articles of Treaty on a nation-to-nation relationship. I think that's kind of where we're at, you know, when you're talking about dismantling, abolishing, or amending the Indian Act. And the only good thing I know about the Indian Act, it separates us as the original people from the general public. And after that, scrap it, I guess. But before you do that, you must have a mechanism in place to replace it. I know that the treaty was written in a manner that's very meticulous and calculative, because It was more or less corrupt politicians and legal beagles who did not understand our customary ordinance, our customary laws and legal traditions. And that was more or less what was used by our ancestors when they went to negotiate the treaty. And I use the term nations because our ancestors within their own respective nations have an identifiable form of government, territory, population, culture, and language, and that meets the international criteria of nationhood. And the day after treaty, I think we conclude that the articles of treaty or the treaty-making process is held hostage within the parliamentary legislative systems of Canada and Saskatchewan, and that's where we come in. The Crown has done most of their work. That's why there's succeeding and prosperity in their hands, while we, being locked up in reserves, are unable to deal what was negotiated under treaty, because we always had to ask permits to do this, permits to do that. And if you can look at the customary laws, what you refer to as self-government, self-government is not a standalone agenda. You need self-sufficiency, self-adjudication, and self-determination. Customary laws would require a political agenda, a fiscal agenda, and a social agenda. And legal traditions, of course, would require a legal agenda. The four elements have to somehow blend in together where we activate our business implementing and enforcing treaty. And I see a requirement of a legislative process, a process that requires a covenant of First Nations and Crown relations, where high-level officials like the AFN chief, the regional chiefs, come to the table with with cabinet, and they talk in general terminology what needs to be highlighted or what needs to be covered so that both entities benefit from the articles of treaty. And I see a requirement also, a memorandum of what I refer to as the equality constitutional of affirmation. And you have key provisions within Crown legislation, which we believe we can adopt by reference, because those are their documents recognizing us. For example, we talk about land. If you were to look at the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where tracts of lands would be set aside for nations or tribes, and you look at the 1982 Constitution, Section 25, where it mentions the Royal Proclamation, and then in the middle you have Section 9124, which talks about how does it go, lands and lands reserved for Indians, or is it Indians and lands reserved for Indians? Something like that. But if you can somehow connect the three together, and you can make the Crown accountable that this land is for our use and it's for us to share with them. And land air, and water, I've been told, is what we need in order to survive. If you take one out, then we will perish. And if you take the first letter of each word, land, L, air, A, water, W, you get law. So, by coincidence, I guess. And the other thing is a memorandum of order to ensure implementation and enforcement of what is agreed to in the covenant by the officials. So far I'm talking about a covenant and memorandum, and the third is an accord on treaty relations and an accord on the application of the fiduciary. Because more or less, how I see it personally is that I am not really exercising treaty rights. I am more or less enjoying prerogative rights under Section 9124, because the fiduciary, the trust obligation is there. And in doing, what I just mentioned, it should give the ability to our leadership, the First Nations, to start occupying the fields by developing political compacts, constitutionalism, and fiscal compacts to generate, manage, and administer funds, and the judicial compacts occupying the field of justice, and occupying that social compacts. There's so much that needs to be done, and I'm abbreviating here something just for your, consideration. And ladies and gentlemen, what I just said, I truly believe our ancestors are still waiting for us to implement and enforce what they ratified in the late 1800s. So those are my comments briefly, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you very much for listening to me. Thanks.
Jimmy Gutch. Does anybody else? I guess we just went right into the sharing circle. I was just wondering if anybody else had any statements or comments that they'd like to make before we call it quits. There's a couple up here, Kayla.
Hi. Self-determination, deciding how your children will be educated, being a nation, independent nation within a state, these are all rights of Indigenous peoples as laid out in the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. And that's what Romeo Saganash is asking Canada to adopt with Bill 262. Just wanted to say that.
Miigwech.
Hi. About pipelines, the question was, would our leaders take the pipelines? I believe strongly that I think our leaders will make the right choice if they grew up listening to their grandparents' stories. My grandparents' stories were that a pipeline was a huge snake poisoning our people, and slowly they're gonna kill us all. And if our leaders have respect for themselves, they'll do the right thing. I believe strongly that our leaders have always listened to their grandparents and their ancestors' stories. And to this day, we have 3 trap lines ourselves, and we've been offered hydro, but we haven't accepted, and we still have our land, and it's called High Rock and Dry Brew. And we're not going to allow pipelines to go, or hydro to go through our trap line or our land. So the story of my grandfather, I believe strongly to this day that these pipelines are poisoning all and the next generation. So I have faith in our leaders. Thank you.
To thank everybody for coming out today, sharing your input, learning new information. We have a long journey ahead of us, obviously, and we have different paths in front of us that we could take. So our choice has to be a wise one. I'd like to call up Elder Wally Swain and Grand Chief Nepenak for the closing remarks and closing prayer, please.
Miigwech Anishinaabe, for those who are still here, we've had many people coming through the door throughout the day. I want to thank all those who have traveled. We recognize those who were here from Niagara Falls this morning, for example, community members from Red Earth who had come in from Saskatchewan to share perspective and to observe what we're doing here. And of course, all the young people, our elders who have give us good guidance to make this a successful day. And of course, all the AMC staff, the political staff, the technicians who make sure that this event happens in a good way. I want to thank the cooks for the wonderful food, the Bannock. The lunch was really, really good today. And of course, none of this happens if we don't come together and make a commitment to hear each other out on these important issues. And this is the conclusion of the second Tea and Bannock dialogue, a commitment that I made as part of the education and awareness campaign that goes along with the abolishment of the Indian Act as a mandate from the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs received at Dakota Teepee earlier this year. I think it's critical that we continue to create spaces where critical inquiry and thought can happen, where we can all come together, bring our young ones out, and share ideas about who we are and who we're going to be on a going forward basis. This is a safe place for people to participate in, and it's made safe by the ceremonies that are created, and brought to us by our elders. So, Chimigwech to Elder Wally Swain, Elder Tobosonokwet for bringing his drum and singing for us this morning. And with that said, we're now going to close the ceremony until the next time we come together for Tea and Bannock number 3. We're not sure where that's going to be yet or when that's going to be, but I'd like Anishinaabe Wally Swain to close us off in a good way. Miigwech, thank you.
As I tell Creator that we're going home for the night, take the good things you've heard and leave the negative stuff behind. Don't take it with you, but take those good remarks that's been shared with you, and that so that we can apply those in our own lives. So I encourage you to do that for yourself. We also win. Mawanange. Ami samino we ano ebet Anishinaabe. Ami oega imitajindang. Aninge yijin not me goizet. Out in Akonigaven. Ami just get to go away any. Chinakumi goizet. I get away any. Me got stood. Me not matthew. Ami just get me now she tandang. Ami so edi wabadung no okay. How up me shot. Up it leaving. I get away in the ske. When it isn't a good yacht, you had each other. When it usually turned the mat, or going to go on a catch mat. I get the small canary petagossing. I get Kagi Petivash, Kagi Piggy get it. I get away any year on his sing. You had more Kimmerak, or any his own inch. Which been the Mazat Anishinaabe. There's get away and Johnny gave out, and the guy on Pionchi was sick with out. Oh, and it's a knob me goes yet, or any to win a moment now, yeah. I get this to go away any, where we was me going. And a snake a moment thought among me no marcy and got it. God, they do this young, God, they kill this young. I go get away any. Your mother's going to want to was a wit and a snabbe. Oh, and it's yak come any much, the way to cause it. And again, you should now go at your knee gone. I get away and no shame, Nanik, than Copachigan and Nanik. Oh, and no tree no, Jonas, Nick of Matsunia. I get me over you back, and Nago to the Mungito. I wait the need was the Anna Kipachigan. Wait the Anigan. I may say there's Nago to Hinchigan. I made this way to get the mark toast now, the mark about now. Me got you.